Hello and welcome. I'm David Sykes from PRMA Consulting, joined by my colleague Jan McKendrick to share our thoughts on the emerging role of value frameworks in oncology. This is the second in our spring webinar series. The third webinar of the series, Does 1 + 1 Always Equal 2? Valuing Combinations, will be broadcast on Wednesday, March the 23rd. If you have not already done so, please visit the PRMA Consulting website to sign up. Today, I'll begin the session with a quick review of the key emerging trends in oncology market access, as well as an overview of the existing value frameworks in oncology. We'll hand over to Jan, who will take us through a critical review of the existing value frameworks, and using case studies, we'll highlight some of the factors that influence outcomes from these assessments. Jan will then outline some considerations from a market access perspective, and I will close with some concluding remarks. Some housekeeping. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions, so please type your questions in the lower box on the dash panel as illustrated on this slide. We will aim to answer all questions that have been asked, but if time does not permit, then we will get back to you, specifically the individuals who've asked the questions after the webinar. And please note that questions will only be visible to the PRA team. We also have a couple of questions for you, the audience, which will be displayed on the screen, and you'll be able to vote through the WebEx interface. We would appreciate if you're able to answer those questions. Thank you. So, as we all know, market access is becoming more challenging across pretty much every country and every payer archetype. This slide highlights some of the key emerging market access trends as they relate to oncology. And all of these dimensions touch on the concepts and learnings we will discuss today. We're very much used to HTA decision making, which covers all these concepts outlined in the slide. But today we'll share the current format of the value frameworks and how they focus on selected concepts and how these concepts differ across the frameworks as well. So as you can see from this slide, this is a summary of the timeline of the recently launched value frameworks, and Jan will talk in more detail about these when I pass over. But certainly in the US, recently there's been a shift amongst payers, providers and patients towards a focus on demonstrating proven quantifiable value in healthcare. So this shift, driven by a number of factors, including the greater availability of high quality data, as well as the rapidly increasing costs of cancer care, including the costs of new cancer drugs, has precipitated this increase in the number of value frameworks. Obviously, outside the US, many countries have driven such value-based assessments, and these have been the norm for many years in many other countries. So in terms of today's presentation, we're going to focus on these 5 value frameworks outlined here. So these are all laudable initiatives which try to tackle very important and challenging questions on value in oncology, and by their own admission are viewed as works in progress. So we need to bear that in mind as we're going through the presentation, and we'll touch on some of those issues throughout the rest of the presentation. I'm going to hand over to Jan now, who will take us through the next part of the presentation. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, David. I'm going to start today by looking at why these value frameworks might have evolved, and then their place and role in assessing value and therefore informing decision making. So in recent years, there's been a significant increase in the new oncology treatments coming to market. And you can see on this example from our previous webinar, the example of advanced melanoma. It highlights just how quickly a treatment area can evolve, and with a number of different products coming to market, used either alone or in combination with other treatments already existing. So this has led to complex treatment pathways, and the complexities coupled with an increasing level of uncertainty around the clinical value for some of the treatments, since some of them are launching with smaller populations and in some cases with less mature evidence base. So in many cases then, clinical guidelines struggle to keep up with this pace of change, and clinicians and patients are still faced with making choices between different individual treatments. In response to this and other pressures, several value frameworks which are relevant for oncology were developed. So a number of different versions of a value framework have been published by influential bodies such as ASCO and ESMO, as well as by individual institutions such as Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the independent ICER. So between May and October last year then, 5 major initiatives were launched, and there may indeed be many more. But they're all aimed at understanding the value of new oncology products from one perspective or another. So we'll take a look at each of these in turn later, but to fully understand the impact they may have on decision making, we need to take a closer look at that decision making process and what value means in that context. So within a healthcare system, decisions are made at multiple levels. So at the healthcare system level, it's a population or group decision, where the focus is usually on efficient allocation of potentially scarce resources. It's clear from these assessments whether or not the product adds value at the population level, but the challenge remains it doesn't mean that those drugs are all effective for the individual patient in front of a clinician. So where choices are being made between treatments, the clinician's disease knowledge and their clinical experience is a very, very important consideration, particularly as we've seen in fast-moving clinical areas like oncology, where the guidelines can't keep up with the rate of change and the evolving evidence base. In addition, we have patient perspective. They may have different preferences, different ways they wish to receive their care, and different priorities about the treatments they receive. So in all of these cases, it's about value, but different attributes might be important, and they might be valued differently at group versus individual levels. So it's really important to think about which elements are important to each decision and how the preferences for them can be captured and built into the decision making. So as we all know, value is a very complex and multi-dimensional idea, and it's certainly not a universal one-size-fits-all concept. So as we've shown on this slide, there are many possible aspects of value, and we've shown some, but clearly not all of them here. So at different levels of decision making, value can take on a different meaning. So at the national level, for example with an HTA body, it's predominantly safety and efficacy which drive the decisions, and potentially impact of quality of life, and for some, cost and unmet need. For patients, it might be something different. It might be about convenience of the treatment regimen, or the impact it might have on the carers or their families. For policymakers, value could be defined even more broadly to include aspects such as innovation. So value and how it's perceived can differ according to stakeholders, and the value frameworks really have to be considered in that context. So in the next section then, we're going to take a closer look at the value frameworks, and I'll work through them chronologically. There are lots and lots of publications relating to these scales, so we're not going to go through intricate details, but rather give you a flavour of what's contained so we can explore some of the concepts later. So first of all, the ESMO framework was launched in May last year, and it really was designed as a tool to assist clinicians with making choices between cancer medicines for their patients. It's called the Magnitude of Clinical Benefit Scale, and it could be argued, I guess, that it's not a true value framework, but it does include many of the key aspects of value, so we will consider it alongside the others. So when it was developed, its aim was to produce, and I quote, a rational, structured and consistent approach, and it was to look at clinically meaningful benefit. So really, it was designed to help clinicians unpack the clinical benefit for different drugs to help them make informed choices. ESMO's scale itself generates a single outcome score for any drug, and it has separate scoring systems depending on whether the drugs are potentially curative or not. The scores are relatively crude, and they're designed really to be simple to use. So for the curative side, you end up with a grade A, B, or C, and it's A and B that represent substantial improvement. If it's a non-curative drug, there are grades 1 to 5, and 4 and 5 represent substantial improvement. Next, in June 2015, the ASCO Value Framework was released. This was really designed as a user-friendly, standardized tool for physicians so they could use it in the clinical setting when having discussions and making choices for their patients. So in terms of the decision-making level, it sits somewhere between clinician and patient. So the framework focuses really on assessing clinical benefit and toxicity, and the total score that's derived from the scale really does focus in on those two aspects. You can get bonus points in this scale for improvements in cancer-related symptoms and improvement in treatment-free time, but the dominating factors really are efficacy and safety. So although cost is included within the ASCO framework, it really sits alongside the others. It's not incorporated into their scoring system. That same month, in June 2015, the drug Abacus from the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center was published. It's a very interesting interactive tool which includes lots of various component parts of value, but it's really geared towards understanding the price-value relationship. So what it does, it allows you to decide how the individual components of the system, how much they should matter to you in terms of defining value. Once you decide that, and you can use this very interactively, you have a set of results and you compare your estimated price with the drug's actual price. So you can see this is really designed to be a healthcare system application looking at a population-based decision. However, because it's interactive and it's available online, there's really nothing to stop it from being used by clinicians when they're considering different treatments. However, there is a real depth and complexity to this tool. There are some quite detailed assessments carried out outside of the tool itself, and that although the dimensions included in the tool might be applicable to a wide range of stakeholders, some of the preferences you need to express might not be very clear to individual clinicians. So for example, you have to include a preference for R&D costs and how much weighting you're prepared to give that in terms of a drug's value. So shortly after the drug Abacus was produced, the ICER also published, as part of their Integrated Evidence Rating Initiative, they published their framework in July 2015. So the ICER is slightly different in that it produces reports of a summary of the evidence, and they're aimed at facilitating discussions about the value of a new drug as a basis for price and coverage decisions. So again, this really is aimed at policymakers and other stakeholders at the healthcare system level. So in this framework, the ratings are inbuilt, and they're obtained through a collaborative method using discussion and deliberation in public appraisal meetings, but also include votes from an expert panel, which includes clinicians, methodologists, and patient advocates. So in some ways, this tool really does have multiple perspectives included within it. Finally, we're going to turn our attention to the NCCN evidence blocks. These were first published back in October 2015, and the launch statement for them recognised that in cancer care, the most important value perspective is really that of the individual patient. So the evidence blocks were developed as a tool to educate providers and patients, and providing a basis for shared decision making. So that's why we've sat this framework in between the clinician and the patient level of decision making. As with the ICER, these evidence blocks are a published set of assessments, so it's not a tool you can use yourself. They're developed by a panel of experts and who review the available evidence and come to their recommendations. And several of these have been published already on the NCCN website. They're a really very visual way of representing the outcomes of the drugs, literally in blocks, kind of like Lego building blocks. And because there's no weighting given to the different components, patients can weigh up the different attributes themselves. So it's designed really to be an interactive discussion between the clinician and the patient where preferences can be discussed. So the 5 frameworks we've described are targeted at different stakeholders, as I hope we've shown you. And you can see then that it's not surprising that they've got different approaches to assessing value. So in some countries there are really formal systems in place already to address value at the healthcare system level, and 2 of these frameworks are also aimed at system decision making. But it's fair to say that in all countries there are still decisions to be made for the individual patient in front of a clinician. And really some of these frameworks have evolved in response to the clinician's desire for easily accessible tools where they can compare the relative value of the different treatment options and make decisions, informed decisions, for their patients. So importantly, these frameworks really could be a very useful means of allowing patients and clinicians to express their preferences for the different potential components of value. As you can see from this table then, the frameworks have taken different approaches to the assessment of value, and different elements of value are included in each of them. As I've mentioned earlier, there are lots and lots of details behind these frameworks, and there are many, many publications to help people understand the different attributes. I'm not going to go into the finer details, but a quick compare and contrast of the attributes will help put things in perspective and see how the tools could be used to support decision making. So one thing the frameworks all have in common is that they consider an improvement in efficacy to be very important. However, for all frameworks except perhaps the NCC and evidence blocks, this is highly specific to the context of a clinical trial, a single clinical trial, and the effect size from that trial. The frameworks also take slightly different approaches to efficacy endpoints, and in a few cases this is through a pre-specified hierarchy. So for example, where OS has more weighting than PFS, which in turn has more weighting than response. We'll see through an example later, this could actually impact the outcomes of a drug through the lens of some of these frameworks. Only 2 of the frameworks make a formal distinction between curative and non-curative treatments. It's not really a fundamental feature of the other tools, although in some subtle ways it is included in a couple more, but really ASCO and ESMO report different scoring systems for curative and non-curative drugs. Only 2 of the frameworks really include any aspect of quality of life, so ESMO includes it more explicitly into their outcomes rating. So for trials that have OS and PFS endpoints, you can get bonus points if you show a quality of life improvement, if that's a secondary endpoint in your trial. The ICER framework has a category of other benefits and disadvantages, and that could include impact on patients and carers, so in some way that too includes patient quality of life. Most of the frameworks do consider cost. So I mentioned earlier the ESMO magnitude of clinical benefit scale was really designed to unpack the clinical benefit, and that's the one that cost is not included. For the others, 2 of them, ASCO and the NCCN, cost sits alongside the other elements. And for the other 2, for the Memorial Sloan Kettering and ICER, cost is a fundamental component which may well reflect their bias towards healthcare decision-making, healthcare system decision-making. So you can see there's lots of differences between the frameworks, some subtle and some not so subtle. And the different value components might reflect the level at which these frameworks influence decision-making. So there have been lots and lots of articles published, several since we started developing this webinar, about how these frameworks could evolve over time. And that's clearly something that will need to be considered, as we know, it took several years for the NICE system to become embedded in the UK. However, the differences in scores of the current frameworks really show that there's no clear consensus on how to define or measure value, and we're going to take a little bit closer look at that in the next section. So I'm now going to look at a few influencing factors in the frameworks, and we're going to use some examples to make some key points, which might be relevant if you're considering the market access implications. So before we go to the examples, it's important to remember there are different elements of value. We've seen that already. And just the inclusion of different elements will in itself drive different outcomes, reflecting that value is not easy to define or quantify. However, differences in methodology may also drive differences in outcome, and two key areas are worth considering. So first of all, the scoring. Most of these frameworks come out with a single score, and categories are inbuilt into many of the systems that thresholds exist between one score and another. So for example, in the ASCO framework, if your improvement in median PFS is 0 to 24%, you have grade 1, and 25% upwards would be a different grading. But how are those thresholds determined? Who made that decision, and how can we understand it? The second part is not just how the scoring is, but how those attributes are weighted. How is it decided how much weight one thing is given? Another example, again from the ASCO framework, if you are assessing the drug and you can assess it based on OS data, the weighting is 16. If you're determining the outcome based on PFS, it's 11. So again, there are different elements, there are different ways they are scored, and there are different weights for them as well. So really, in order for these value frameworks to be effective decision-making tools, they not only need to have a clear and transparent set of criteria, but it also needs to be clear which preferences are included and how they're valued, and that's reflected through scoring and weighting. In the frameworks as they stand, the preferences are not always clear. The weighting might be implicit rather than explicit. So for example, ASCO and ESMO have inbuilt weighting systems, whereas the drug Abacus, you can be flexible with your own. And it's also not clear what the grounds are for choosing these weights. Whose preference is that? So as it stands, the methodological basis is not always clear, and it's not always the same as you may think around an HTA submission, for example, where increasingly these are becoming part of the system-wide decision-making. A question's asked at the population level, evidence is gathered to support that question, and then a decision's made based on that evidence, whether or not we have clinical or cost effectiveness. So these frameworks right now don't necessarily have the same attributes as an HTA assessment, and it's important to remember that as you review them. So to explore these issues a little bit further, we looked at some recent FDA approvals and tried to establish how they would fare in some of the frameworks, and whether there are key issues that impact both interpretation and application of the frameworks. We're going to focus on a comparison of ASCO and ESMO, mostly because they have published scoring systems which you can apply to any situation, whereas some of the others may rely more heavily on a background assessment. However, the contrast and the points that we'll illustrate hopefully are still relevant across many of the frameworks. So the first example is unituxin dinutuximab. It's a drug for pediatric patients with neuroblastoma. And their FDA evidence package was a phase 3 trial of combination therapy versus retinoic acid alone. They had a primary endpoint of event-free survival. Their phase 3 trial was stopped early, where the median EFS for the comparator was nearly 2 years, but had not been reached for the drug of interest, unituxin. An OS analysis conducted also generated a hazard ratio, but the median OS wasn't reached in either arm. So if we look at how this drug fares in the frameworks then, it really depends on whether this drug is considered curative or not. And you could argue that a nearly 2-year median EFS on the comparator arm, that might be indicative of curative. The frameworks are not clear on where this cutoff is. But under the ASCO framework, if this drug is considered not curative, it gets a 0 score. There's no median OS, there's no median PFS, and there was no response rate, so it can't score. However, if it's considered curative, the HR for the overall survival can be used, and it gets a relatively decent score. A fairly similar approach under ESMO. If it's considered non-curative, then the primary endpoint is not OS or PFS, and there's no improvement in the 3 other domains, and it again gets no score, whereas if it is considered curative, it comes out with a grade A, which is the top evidence level. So this is a really nice example of how the frameworks operate sometimes with subjective criteria. So it's important to understand the nuances of these frameworks and how value will be potentially viewed differently through a different lens. The second example is Keytruda pembrolizumab for the treatment of an unresectable and metastatic melanoma. This was an extension to an original indication, and this was to include initial treatment. So their evidence package consisted of 2 phase 3 trials, both against an active comparator. The one we're going to focus on is a first-line trial, but there was also a refractory trial. There were co-primary endpoints of PFS and OS, but the median OS was not reached. So under the frameworks then, under the ASCO framework, PFS as the primary endpoint, a moderate increase resulted in a score of 22 out of 130. Under the ESMO framework, it's the same data, again with a moderate increase in PFS with a hazard ratio of 0.58, but to get to the next level of benefit, it really depends on what you think about the comparator. There's a different threshold to get to one or the other, and in some ways it biases towards end-of-life therapies where your gain in PFS is slightly less big than if it's not end-of-life. So it's also not really very clear. At this point, it's worth considering, what does a score of 22 mean on the ASCO framework? It's not clear how that can be used unless you compare it with other drugs, which may come from trials with different comparators. It's also not clear from this example how you'd combine scores for the 2 different trials in this case, because each framework considers a trial on its own. The other interesting point is, from a NICE perspective, they have also assessed pembrolizumab, and they estimated that the extrapolated OS gain would be around 3.5 months. But this wouldn't be reflected anywhere in these value frameworks because the focus is on the regulatory trial. So there really is a disconnect between looking at a trial and the totality of the evidence, and that again is very important to understand. The last example then is from Darzalex daratumumab, a treatment for multiple myeloma in patients who've had prior treatment. It was given breakthrough designation and gained regulatory approval by the FDA based on a phase 2 single-arm trial which had ORR as its primary endpoint. Unfortunately, phase 2 single-arm studies don't fare very well in any of these frameworks. And in this case, for example, ASCO not only gives a challenging criteria for ORR, but it downweights the single-arm trial results quite heavily. So the outcomes of these frameworks may actually be counter to some of the regulatory structures, such as the Breakthrough Therapy Designation or EMA Prime, which are trying to encourage earlier access to medicines with smaller data packages. So HTA will look at the evidence package, including the potential for historical controls. So it is possible to get access with potentially a challenge around price, and they'll also want to explore uncertainty in the data, another aspect which is largely uncovered in these frameworks. So I hope from these examples we've given you a good flavour of what they contain and how the different sets of preferences and judgments can influence the outcomes, sometimes quite significantly. I'm now going to hand back to David, and he'll discuss how these frameworks can be incorporated into market access thinking.
Thanks, Jan. Some interesting case studies there to highlight some of the potential unintended consequences or potential disincentives through these value frameworks. So Jan's presentation highlights a number of considerations from a market access perspective as we think about incorporating evidence needs for the value frameworks into the broader context of demonstrating value. Of course, as we're all familiar, value and the definition and evidence requirements around that differ according to stakeholder. So if we think about how we can understand how these value frameworks evolve and how they're used to make decisions, it's absolutely critical to understand how we think about which stakeholders use them, identifying and understanding the potential disincentives and disconnects between different stakeholder requirements, and understand whether these frameworks will be used in a broader HTA or access context, and also important to anticipate how they evolve and develop. So critically, understanding how your technology is likely to score in the frameworks is a critical first point. As Jan outlined, some of the frameworks are transparent and easily accessible, so understanding potential score and potential trade-offs around trial design are going to be critical there. Being able to think through the potential impact on the value assessment framework of a proposed registrational trial design is going to be absolutely critical, because remember, the focus on the frameworks is on a trial as opposed to the totality of evidence. We think it's really critical to understand how you develop an integrated strategy to meet evidence requirements for both regulators, HTAs, and value frameworks. There are likely to be inconsistencies in trying to develop such an approach, as Jan highlighted with the Darzalex example. But it's important to understand and anticipate them. Is this going to be a complaint or a criticism, and from which stakeholder, and what potential strategies or additional evidence do you have available to you which could mitigate those complaints or criticisms? We believe that whilst the value frameworks are important, while they are laudable in their aims, they are works in progress, and it will take quite some time before they become potentially entrenched in decision making. So our advice would be to continue to develop the value story and associated evidence base from the regulatory and HTA perspective as the primary focus. It's what we've been doing for a number of years, and that should continue to be the primary focus as we have outlined. But it's also important to make sure you do have an eye on the value frameworks, their evidence needs, and understand where your product profile is likely to be able to work within the context of the frameworks, and also to be able to explain and counter areas that may not be scored highly within the value frameworks. Jan talked about the preference weightings and how these may be fairly arbitrary, and some of these frameworks may be fairly blunt, but it's absolutely critical to be proactive and generate evidence to drive the debate about where your product fits in this framework and where the framework is too blunt to detect or to identify potential value drivers. So we set off to start to understand some of the issues around whether the existing value frameworks provide clarity or confusion. As we've mentioned, these are works in progress, and there's going to be a number of iterations based on these existing frameworks, which will lead to improvements in the tool. But in terms of clarity, I think they're here to stay. I think they do have a potential to provide context to understand value for multiple stakeholders, and they will undoubtedly make decision making more transparent. From a confusion perspective, I think there's some fairly fundamental issues from a methodological perspective, and the next iterations of these frameworks need to anticipate and understand these issues around addressing the totality of evidence, potential issues around uncertainty and absolute and relative effect, as well as thinking about the rapidly evolving landscape. All those issues need to be addressed. As Jan talked about, there's a potential disconnect in incentives with the needs of regulatory and HTA bodies who are trying to drive earlier access to medicines where there are very clear and high unmet needs. The value frameworks as they currently stand don't support that and potentially disincentivize those frameworks and those agendas. And then there's also a concern that these frameworks could be used inappropriately in decision making and taken out of context, and we'll start to see that rapidly evolve over the next 12, 18 months as we get more feedback from the marketplace about their application. So I think our key takeaway is, value frameworks are here to stay. They are an important part of decision making and will be moving forward. And it's important as products are being developed to ensure that manufacturers are developing a cohesive value story supported by an integrated evidence package which sets out to meet the needs of multiple stakeholders from a regulatory, value framework and HTA and clinician perspective. And it's also important to make sure that you're communicating that convincingly and it's targeted at the right stakeholder as well. So with that, I'm going to open up to some questions. And the first question is relates to the role of ESMO and HTA. So Jan, the first question is to you, and we've talked about ESMO as a value framework in Europe, and the question is, given the maturity of HTA in Europe, what role do you think the ESMO value framework could play in HTA decision making at the national level?
I think the first thing to say is I think the ESMO framework came from quite a different place. It came from a real clinician judgment perspective. They wanted a tool to help them make judgments in a transparent way. So I see that tool as being really helpful in that way. I'm not sure it's got the methodological robustness to replace HTA or take its role in there, but it could help as a kind of subsequent to HTA if you unpack the evidence base and unpack that for a clinician. So I think it has a role, but I don't believe in its current format that it's methodologically strong enough nor designed in the way that really it would replace HTA.
Yeah, and I think it's also fair to say that the feedback we get from payers and decision makers is exactly consistent with that they don't really see a significant, if any, role for that value framework at the national level. Where they do believe it could offer value is more at the clinician level, at the local access level. Okay, so Jan, what do you think of the NPC response to the ASCO framework?
Yeah, that's a response that we saw recently, and recently it really did pick up some of the methodological challenges we've already talked about today. It was focused a lot on the ASCO framework, but really a lot of what it mentioned was stuff that was relevant to many, many frameworks. I think it's fair to say, the frameworks have not tried to be the be all and end all. This is their first iteration for all of them, really. So I think it'd be fair to say they need to evolve and take on the criticisms that they've received from the value debate that has now been kicked off. So they are probably need to improve, but they're not going to go away. So I think it's worth just tracking the debate and being positive, kind of like how NICE evolved in the UK. You start from a place and it evolves to a better place. So.
Yeah. Okay, the next question relates to that first question around HTA, and do you think with further methodological development, value frameworks could be used in HTA?
So I think a lot of the move we're seeing now is for multi-criteria decision making, which is almost taking HTA to another level. So as the frameworks stand right now, they don't have that methodological robustness that HTA does. So maybe in future iterations, if they can work towards how preferences are elicited, they may have a more increasing role, and it'll certainly be interesting to see how they evolve. But as they stand, I don't believe they're methodologically robust enough to have that role.
So the next question relates to evidence generation and patient preferences. And the question is, what potential role do you see for patient preference data to drive the debate about value frameworks and the design and interpretation of those?
So I think the interesting thing about the value frameworks is that they all do incorporate different aspects of value, but it's not clear for any one drug whether those are the correct dimensions to be including. So if you believe that your drug has an influence on a dimension that's not included in the framework, or where it may not do best in the framework, then I would say that generating evidence to prove your point is better than being reactive when you have the frameworks coming out with scores that might not be in your favour. So I would say that some of the patient preference work involving patients closer in your evidence generation, or at least the thinking around patients, would be a very strong position to take.
Yeah, okay. The next question relates to scores. And in general, scores within the frameworks seem to have been quite low compared to the overall potential within the scales. And so should oncology drugs be aiming to do much better?
So I think we had a look at this when we were developing the slides for this webinar. The scores for the ASCO framework, for example, can go as high as 130, and we found relatively few drugs would go above a score of 40. But on closer look at the actual frameworks, it's not that surprising. To get the higher scores, you have to be showing median OS gains of nearly 100%, which is very, very difficult. And to get the level 5 in ASCO, which is the top scoring, you have to be looking at median OS like beyond the end of your trial, which is almost physically not possible. So I think the way that some of the frameworks have been set up, it's very, very difficult to get a high score. And I think that speaks to your point about implementation. So how do you compare a drug with a score of 44 with one of 33? How will that be viewed when it's not 120, which you'd kind of think was a good score? So
Yeah. Great. Okay, well, there's a number of other questions that have come in, and unfortunately we don't have the time to respond to all of those. We will get back to each of the individuals who've asked those questions. We'd like to thank you very much for your time here today, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next webinar on March the 23rd, which looks at the value of combinations. Thanks very much.